Welcome again as we continue now with the decolonization in Kenya. We have just looked at the decolonization in India. You see that long way that we took so that we see everything up to the end. So I invite you again, I invite your attention, your participation by being so attentive and so curious to know everything that happened in Kenya for it to get its independence. So this is now another wonderful part that we are going to see how Kenya got its independence. So let's start with the location of Kenya. So when we talk of Kenya, it's a country that borders with Tanzania, Somalia, Uganda, and Ethiopia, just as our Malawi makes the boundary with Mozambique, Zambia, and Tanzania. Also, Kenya has her neighbors. So the neighbors or neighboring countries of Kenya, they are Tanzania, Somalia, Uganda, as well as Ethiopia. So all those four countries, they make boundary with Kenya. You know, Kenya is in East Africa. So I ask you, go through the map of Africa, see where Kenya is, and see those countries, these countries that we have just mentioned. You see that they are really wonderful countries, just as our Malawi is or also another wonderful country. But we are talking of colonization, so let's talk of colonization in Kenya. So there, it is the thing that we are going to dwell much now, because now we have that idea of colonization, what happened in India up to when they got their independence. So you have that good idea. So now we are starting the journey of Kenya. How did Kenya got its independence? So as we did with India, we need to pick it up from that period of when or how Kenya was colonized. So the Europeans, they came to Kenya when the Indians were already there, who settled at the coast as the traders. So it's quite interesting here to say the same Indians who got their independence, but there were some Indians again who were traders. So they were the first people to come, or foreigners to come and settle in the coast of Kenya. So the Europeans, when they came, they found the Indians already there. So first to have colonial interest over Kenya were the Germans. So the Germans, they had that interest to colonize Kenya. So the British, they followed later. So you can see to it, the Germans, they had their first interest. So in 1886, the British and the Germans, they signed the partition agreement in order to resolve their conflict. So these two countries, they were both interested in the colonization of Kenya. So we are saying in 1886, then both they signed that agreement, partition agreement, to say the other part maybe to the British, the other part to the Germans. So in 1889, the British created the Imperial British East African Company to develop their sphere of influence. So after they partitioned Kenya in 1886, the British and the Germans, so the British, they created their company, which was called the British East African Company, that was aimed at developing the part of the British. So the Germans also created the German East African Company. So it was just to counter the British there. So in 1890, the British and the Germans, they signed what was called the Helgoland Agreement. The Helgoland Agreement in 1890. So by this agreement, then the British declared a protectorate over Kenya in 1895. So by that agreement, then the British took over Kenya. So Europeans, they wanted the Kikuyu highlands for agricultural purposes. They wanted the Kikuyu for agricultural purposes. So you have to take note of that this year, 1895, when the British declared Kenya a British protectorate after the Helgoland Agreement, whereby Germany got Tanzania and the British, they got Kenya. The Kikuyu, we have just mentioned the Kikuyu highlands. So we are saying that the Kikuyu or Kenyan highlands, they were most fertile areas. So they were the part that were fertile. That's why they wanted the area for agricultural purposes. So Kenya had no minerals, but Kikuyu had a promising, a very good potential. So there was a potential in Kikuyu. So with that economic potential, we see to it that the Africans, on the other hand, in the area, they could not be relied on for economic development of the country. So much as the Kikuyu had that economic potential, but the Africans who owned that land, who were occupying that land, they could not be relied on, they could not be trusted for economic development. Then the whites resolved to drive out the natives from Kikuyu highlands into the reserves. So you can see to it that the whites, they wanted that federal land to maximize it. But that land, it was in the hands of primitive people, or people who could not do anything with that land. So the whites resolved to drive them out and put them somewhere in the reserves. So Kikuyu highlands also had cool climate for European settlement. So it was not only for agricultural purposes, but also for settlement in Kikuyu. If you can flash back, we also mentioned of why the whites chose the Shire Highlands. Mainly is for the cool weather for settlement. That's why when the UMCA came, they settled at Magomero in the Shire Highlands. The reason was that the climate there were just good. Africans in the reserves, they were restricted to move. So in the reserves, when they were driven out, when they were driven out, the Africans, they were restricted to move. They were required to carry a big metallic identity card in the neck, which was called kipande or pass. So they were carrying that identity in their neck to show that they have a pass to move somewhere. So African experienced problems now in the reserves, that is the new places that were created for them. So what were the problems of Africans in the reserves? Number one, overcrowding, because it was like they were just shifted from one place to say, now we have created a place for you to settle. Move out of the Kikuyu highlands, no one should settle there. Then hunger. Apart from overcrowding, then there was hunger, then poverty, then lack of pasture land. So they were just like packed together with few resources there. So Africans who remained in the white-owned land were used as labor tenants. So you can remember, or you can connect this one to what happened in Zimbabwe again. We also mentioned of the same. Then the local chiefs were used to ensure forced labor. So let's look at the factors. What were the factors that led to the development of nationalism in Kenya? So factors for the development of nationalism in Kenya. So number one was the colonial land problem. Just as we have pointed out to say Africans were forced out of the Kikuyu highlands. So with that then, people were not happy. So after the First World War, land grievances increased due to inequitable land distribution. So what it meant that uh, all the land that was good in Kenya, all that land, the good land, it was taken by the whites. As a result, people, they were grieving for their land. So huge chunks of land were sold to the whites. That is the war veterans. So those whites war veterans, they were given big chunks of land. That land was also the good land. So the Kikuyu wanted land redistribution. So the Kikuyu people, the Africans, they wanted the redistribution of land to say, no, this is very unfair. How can you give a big portion of land to a single person and while packing other people in one area? So there was colonial land problem as the first factor. The next one is taxation, or was taxation policy. So Africans, they hated the heavy and harsh colonial policies or taxation policies. So those who failed to pay the tax either lost their land or were imprisoned. Just as it was with Zimbabwe, if you can remember, it was all the same. So people, they were grieving for their land in the same manner, So the only way to raise the tax for people to find money to pay for the tax was to work for long hours on the European farms. So it's just what we did on the land policies in Zimbabwe, Northern Rhodesia, as well as Nyasaland. So cash economy was a burden to Africans who were used to barter system. Remember, we also talked about this some time ago in Form 3 when we said that people, or the whites, they introduced money, or that is cash economy. So the Africans, they were not used to the cash. They were used to exchanging of goods. As such, it was a problem. So the Africans had a resentment against the European, the Europeans were in Kenya. So with that, then things were not okay. So taxation policy was another big problem that led to the people to rise for nationalism, to say, why are you forcing us to pay you in form of money, while we are used to pay to each other in exchange of goods? The other factor for the development of nationalism was the racial segregation. So Africans had to live away from the whites, and the African location were far from the railways and the roads. Not only that, also Africans were restricted to grow certain cash crops, such as coffee, which was a profitable crop. And also markets offered different prices for the same commodities for Africans as well as for the Europeans. So you can see it here that all these factors that we have just mentioned here, they talk about segregation. While the same thing is allowed for the whites, for the Africans it was not. So you see to it, the same people, they are farmers, but others, they are forbidden to grow coffee. Maybe they have produced maybe the same crops. Now to the marketplace, you find that the price for the Africans for the same commodity, the same quality, you find that it is different with the price of the Europeans. So those were segregation, it was called racial segregation, that these others to do this and not Africans. So Africans were not happy with that. Hence, they developed the colonialist, or they developed the nationalist ideas to say, what if we become independent and claim Kenya for the Kenyans? Another one is Western education. So on Western education, the Christian missionaries, they provided Western education in the colonial era. So missionary schools, they produced the educated Africans. Just as it was with India, we mentioned about this, to say when people got education, uh, uh, then they were able to question some of the policies. So educated Africans, they provided leadership for nationalism. They were at the forefront to state nationalism because they were able to question some of the policies of the whites. And also Africans were able to argue for equality. Yeah, just as Christianity is preaching. So at the same time, it is so funny to say at the same time, the whites were claiming to be Christians, good people favored by God, and not the primitive religion or the African religion was disregarded. But at the same time, they were practicing racial segregation. So Africans were able to question after they got that education to say, no, we are taught that Christianity teaches that we are equal before God. So why should you do the racial segregation? So they were able to question such things. Another factor for the rise of nationalism in Kenya was the First and Second World Wars. The war itself, it weakened European countries economically and militarily to resist the revolutions. So Kenyans, under the influence of ex-servicemen, that is the soldiers who fought in the war, and the Mau Mau, they got united and fought for the safe rule. So you see to it, we are also going to mention or to dwell much a little bit on the Mau Mau. So the people, the Kenyans, they got that influence from the soldiers who fought in the war. And war also, the war contract enticed the Kenyans to join war under the British in order to buy political independence, just as it was with India, whereby the Indians were promised to say after we win the war, we are going to grant independence. So the same thing happened in Kenya, whereby the Kenyans, they were also promised to say after we win the war, the British is going to grant independence. So it was like a war contract. And again, the Japanese victory over the whites during the war, it also brought some positive attitudes among the Kenyans that they could also defeat the whites. They could also do better against the whites. And another factor for the rise of nationalism was the formation of the United Nations Organization. So the UNO Charter, remember this one, we talked about it. The UNO Charter stipulated that people were free to rule themselves and choose the government they wanted. Remember this one? Self-determination policy started way back. So it was to be taken as hypocrisy for the whites if uh, this one, it did not apply to the Kenyans. So the Kenyans were also fighting or arguing in the lines of self-determination policy, which was also advanced by the United or during the formation of the United Nations Organization. And another factor for the rise of nationalism in Kenya was the change in the balance of power. So look at this. Before Second World War, Britain and France were the superpowers. But after the war, USA and Russia became the superpowers. Remember, we have dwelt much on the same when we are talking of the when we talked about the Cold War. The two superpowers that were fighting were USA as well as Russia. So USA used the UN to preach against imperialism. So USA was preaching against imperialism. You know, on the other hand, USA had no colony. With that, then they were fighting against imperialism. So they were using the United Nations. So Britain and France came out of the war economically crippled and could not sustain the imperialism, which was also headed by the USA. So with that, then we see to it the change in the balance of power, whereby the USA now became the superpower alongside with the Russia. So USA, being the superpower, was preaching against the imperialism, and Britain and France could not withstand the imperialism because they were economically weak after the war. Therefore, they easily accepted nationalist campaigns after the 1945.
Simutaya nthawi yanu kufunafuna maphunziro muzakhala wotumidwa moyo wanu wonse. Ngati simuphunzira anthu azingokutumani ajala kalime ajala kuchwe manyazi ajala katende yanti ndipo anthu ophunzira wandu wotuma so kwambiri. Ndiye ngati simuphunzira skulu akuyikirani apa mukhala otumidwa.